You've been stretched thin since the funeral, Miles. Maybe it's time to step back.
I'm fine.
Fine doesn't close a contract like Wake County.
We've already started conversations. I'm sure they are.
We've got this.
That morning, Caleb walked into the room like he already owned it. He had the easy confidence of a man who believed the outcome had been settled before the meeting began. He told me to step back, take the week off, said things were moving in the right direction, his direction. He spoke the way people do when they're certain nothing can surprise them anymore. What he didn't know was that 2 days earlier, I had installed 5 cameras in my own home. And what those cameras had already captured, what exactly were they planning to do with my name? If you're someone who believes that the truth has a way of surfacing, that patience and evidence matter more than noise, this channel is for you. Hit subscribe and stay with us. There's a lot more where this came from. My father built Arden building controls out of a rented warehouse and a used pickup truck. That's not a metaphor or a family legend polished by time, it's just the truth. Gordon Arden spent the first 3 years of the business sleeping 4 hours a night, driving to job sites before sunrise, and doing the kind of work that leaves permanent calluses on your hands. By the time I was old enough to understand what he did for a living, the company had grown into something real. 30 employees, a reputation for clean installations and contracts with some of the larger commercial properties in Raleigh. He never talked about it like an achievement, he talked about it like a responsibility. When he died 2 years ago, he left the company equally to me and my brother Caleb. No conditions, no hierarchy written into the will, just 2 names on a document and the assumption that we'd figure out the rest. I handled operations, the technical side, the project management, the crew scheduling, the quality control. Caleb handled business development. He had the kind of personality that made clients feel like they were already friends with him, which is genuinely useful in a relationship-driven industry. And Simone, my wife of 11 years, managed the finances. The accounting systems, the bank accounts, the vendor payments, the quarterly reports. She had an MBA and a methodical mind, and she had come into the role gradually, taking on more responsibility after Gordon's health declined, and we needed someone we trusted to keep the books clean. 3 people, 3 pillars. I thought that was a strength. I didn't see it yet as the architecture of something that could be turned against me. After Gordon died, I threw myself into the work in a way that probably looked from the outside like grief that had nowhere else to go. I was at job sites before my crew arrived. I was reviewing installation specs on weekends. I was the last one out of the office most evenings, and by the time I got home, Simone had already eaten, already retreated to whatever part of the house felt farthest from whatever conversation we weren't having. She complained about it directly at first, that I was choosing the company over the marriage, that she felt invisible, that we had become roommates who split a mortgage. I listened. I told her she was right. I told her things would settle down once the Wake County bid was submitted. Wake County had put out a request for proposals on one of the largest energy control infrastructure upgrades in the region, multiple administrative buildings, a multi-year contract. The kind of deal that would stabilize Arden building controls for at least 5 years and let us hire the additional staff we'd been holding off on. We were a strong candidate. I had spent months preparing our technical documentation. I told myself that once this contract was secured, I'd have the breathing room to be the husband Simone needed. I kept telling myself that even as she started coming home later, her explanations arriving slightly ahead of any questions I might ask. Late sessions with the auditor, a meeting with the bank that ran long, paperwork for the new vendor agreements that couldn't wait. I believed her. That's the part I keep turning over. I believed her because I needed to, and because I was too focused on the wrong deadline. The hotel key card changed that. One morning I was looking for her car keys so she wouldn't have to search through her bag while running late, and I found a key card from the Winslow Hotel tucked into a side pocket of her purse. A parking stub was folded with it. The timestamp read 2:17 in the afternoon on a Wednesday. I remembered that Wednesday specifically because Simone had told me she was staying in the office all afternoon to finalize the payroll. The Winslow was not near our office. It was not near any of our vendor locations. There was no reason for that card to exist. I placed everything back exactly where I'd found it and handed her the car keys without a word. She thanked me and left. I stood in the driveway watching her pull out and tried to decide what kind of man I was going to be about this. The kind who confronts in the heat of it and destroys any chance of knowing the full truth, or the kind who waits. I decided to wait. The advantage I had over most people in that situation was professional. Arden Building Controls installs smart building systems, access control, motion sensors, integrated surveillance architecture. I understand that technology the way a carpenter understands wood grain. When Simone mentioned that weekend that she was driving to Charlotte to visit an old friend, I used the time she was gone to install 5 small cameras in our home. One aimed at the front entrance, one in the living room, one in the upstairs hallway, one in the garage, one in my home office. I stayed out of the bedroom intentionally, not because I was protecting her privacy exactly, but because I already knew that whatever I was looking for wasn't going to be found there. The bedroom wasn't the part of this house that held the things I needed to protect. My office was. The safe in the wall, the documents inside it, the equipment I used to manage our company's digital authorizations, those were what mattered now. I told myself that if the cameras showed me nothing, I'd take them down and never mention them to anyone. I'd chalk it up to paranoia born from exhaustion and find a better way to be present in my marriage. 2 days later, my phone buzzed with a motion alert while I was running diagnostics on a building system across town. The front door camera showed Simone unlocking the house at 2 in the afternoon. The person who followed her inside was Caleb. He wasn't carrying a laptop bag or a folder. He wasn't dressed like someone stopping by between client meetings. He put his hand on her waist before the door finished closing, and in the living room she turned and kissed him with the ease of something that had been practiced many times before. They went upstairs together and stayed there for close to an hour. I watched it on a 3-inch screen in a parking lot, and I remember thinking with a strange clarity that I wasn't surprised. Not at Simone, not exactly, but at Caleb. I had spent my entire adult life trusting him as a partner, deferring to his read on client relationships, defending him when people suggested he pushed the boundaries of professional ethics. He was my brother. That word meant something to me. In a way I realize now, it never meant the same thing to him. But the cameras were still recording, and when they came back downstairs, they didn't leave. They walked directly into my home office. I watched Simone enter the code on the wall safe, my code, which I had never given her, but which she had clearly obtained at some point and never mentioned. Caleb reached inside and removed a stack of documents, my passport, and the encrypted USB drive I used for digital authorization signatures on company contracts. Simone placed a blank sheet of paper over one of my existing signatures and photographed it from multiple angles with her phone, adjusting the lighting, checking the result, photographing again. Caleb stood beside her and spoke in the low, efficient tone of someone running through a checklist. He said that once the audit started, everything would point directly at me. She replied that after they had me suspended, he'd control enough of the voting shares to take over the company outright. I played that exchange back 3 times, standing in the parking lot of someone else's building, listening to my wife and my brother discuss how to make me look like a criminal. I had put up cameras to find out if my marriage was over. What I found instead was something I didn't have a word for, yet something that sat much heavier than betrayal and required an entirely different response. That night, I copied every recorded file to 3 separate hard drives and contacted Malcolm Sayer. Malcolm had been our family's attorney for years, first working with my father on the original incorporation and then staying on as corporate counsel as the company grew. He was careful, methodical, and had no personal loyalty to Caleb or Simone. I told him what I'd seen. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he gave me 3 instructions. Do not confront either of them. Do not change your behavior in any way they might notice. And do not access any financial accounts or systems outside of what you normally touch, because anything that looked like a preemptive move on my part could be framed as evidence of awareness of guilt. What we needed, he said, was evidence gathered through proper process, the kind that would hold up, not the kind that could be challenged as reactive or manufactured. More urgently, we needed to understand what specific crime they were building and what role my name was meant to play in it. The cameras had shown me enough to know I was in danger. They hadn't yet shown me the full shape of what was coming. I drove home that night and ate the dinner Simone had left covered on the stove. She asked how the job site had gone. I told her it had been a long day. She said we should try to get away for a weekend soon, somewhere quiet, just the two of us. I agreed that sounded nice. She went upstairs and I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, looking at nothing in particular, understanding that the version of my life I had been living, the one where I trusted the people closest to me without reservation, had already ended. What I was doing now was something else entirely. I was still inside the house, still at the table, still married on paper and partnered at work. But I was operating from a position that had no name in any of the categories I'd used to understand my own life up to that point. The next morning, I went to the office and sat through a project review with Caleb. He presented expansion ideas with the enthusiasm of a man thinking about the long term, asked me whether I'd had enough sleep, mentioned offhand that I looked tired and should consider taking a few days. He was good at it. He looked me in the eye and spoke like a concerned brother and showed nothing, not guilt, not nervousness, not the smallest flicker of anything that would let an outside observer know what he had done the previous afternoon in my home office while I was across town pretending not to know. I matched him. I nodded at his suggestions. I said I'd think about the days off. I asked a follow-up question about the Wake County timeline that was completely genuine because I still needed that contract to succeed regardless of everything else. 30-some employees were counting on it, and they had done nothing wrong. Then I drove to meet Malcolm's referral, a forensic accountant named Rhea Lawson, who specialized in corporate fraud investigations. We had work to do, and very little time to do it cleanly. Rhea Lawson didn't look like someone who spent her days untangling corporate fraud. She was quiet, methodical, the kind of person who asked one precise question and then waited for the full answer before asking the next one. Malcolm had worked with her on 2 previous cases and trusted her completely. When I laid out what I'd seen on the camera footage, she didn't react with alarm or sympathy. She pulled out a legal pad and started writing. That steadiness was exactly what I needed because I was not steady at all. I was a man going home every night to a house where my wife cooked dinner and talked about weekend plans, while my brother held meetings with clients about a company he was preparing to take from me. The only way I could hold myself together was to stay focused on the work, the real work, the kind Rhea and Malcolm were doing on my behalf, while I maintained the performance of someone who had no idea any of this was happening. Rhea began her investigation without touching anything Simone controlled directly. She worked from backup data, older tax filings, vendor records, and copies of bank statements I had legitimate access to as a co-owner. She was careful not to tip off anyone that a parallel review was underway, which meant she moved slowly, and I had to be patient in a way that cost me something each day. Meanwhile, I was sitting across from Caleb at project meetings, watching him review timelines and suggest operational changes with the casual authority of someone who considered himself the natural heir to everything in that room. He never overplayed it. That was the part that unsettled me most, the control he had over his own expression, the ease with which he occupied space that wasn't fully his yet. Simone was equally composed at home. She made plans. She asked about my schedule. She told me one evening that she'd been thinking we should look at refinancing the house while rates were still manageable, and I said that sounded reasonable, and she smiled and said she'd run the numbers. I sat with that for a long time after she went upstairs. She was still running numbers, her numbers for a future she'd already designed without me in it. The call from Talia came on a Thursday morning, 10 days after I'd first watched that camera footage in a parking lot across town. Simone's younger sister asked if we could meet somewhere away from the office and away from North Hills. I drove to a coffee shop near NC State that neither of us had any particular connection to, and Talia arrived already looking like she'd rehearsed what she was going to say and wasn't sure any version of it would come out right. She told me that Simone had been asking her over the past several months about the legal standards for proving someone was no longer fit to manage financial affairs, not in a clinical way phrased as hypotheticals framed as curiosity. Talia had answered without thinking much of it at the time. She also told me that Simone had asked her to hold on to an envelope. She hadn't been told what was inside, but at some point the seal had loosened and she'd looked. There were copies of divorce papers and what appeared to be formation documents for a new business entity. The name on those documents was Eastline Systems Group. The registered owner was Caleb. Talia said she'd also heard Simone on the phone. She didn't know who was on the other end, saying that after the investigation, I wouldn't be able to hold on to the company, the house, or my reputation. Talia repeated it to me carefully, the way you repeat something you've been carrying and need to finally put down. She said she didn't know the full shape of it, but she knew it was serious, and she couldn't pretend otherwise. I thanked her and told her to keep the envelope exactly where it was and not to say anything to Simone about this conversation. She agreed without hesitation. Whatever complicated loyalty she owed her sister, it didn't extend to watching someone get framed. What Talia confirmed was the thing I hadn't let myself fully articulate yet. This wasn't a plan to steal and disappear. It was a plan to make sure that when they left, I was the one who looked like the thief. They weren't building an exit, they were building a replacement story, one where I was the villain and they were the people forced to take over after discovering what I'd done. That distinction matters. It meant the cameras, the forensic accounting, the documentation Malcolm was assembling, all of it wasn't just about protecting my assets, it was about protecting my freedom. The second time the cameras caught them in my home office about a week after Talia's warning, I was out of town inspecting an installation at a commercial complex on the eastern side of the county. My phone buzzed with the motion alert at just past 7 in the evening. Simone had told me earlier that day she had to stay late at the office. On the screen, she and Caleb were already inside, and this time they'd brought more equipment. A laptop, a portable printer, a stack of invoices, and the company seal I kept in the top drawer of my desk. I watched Simone open the accounting system remotely from her admin credentials and navigate into the transaction approval records. She changed the listed authorizer on a series of past transactions, reassigning my name to payments that had previously been attributed to a vendor review queue. Caleb laid out printed copies of my signature photographs, taken from the session I'd already seen, and began attaching them to contracts I had never signed. They worked with the unhurried efficiency of people who believed they had all the time they needed because they believed I had no idea this was happening. What they said while they worked filled in the pieces I'd been waiting to understand. Over nearly 3 years, Simone had been routing money from Arden Building Controls to an entity called Linden Park Procurement. On paper, Linden Park supplied sensors, control panels, and imported hardware to our projects. In reality, there was no office, no warehouse, no staff, and no inventory. The payments went into accounts Simone controlled and were then distributed across multiple accounts to accumulate capital for Eastline Systems Group, the company she and Caleb planned to operate once I was out of the picture. The total transferred to Linden Park had exceeded $1,180,000. Simone had also opened a corporate credit line in the company's name, $420,000, using documentation that bore 2 signatures identified as mine. Rhea had already found traces of this. When I relayed the camera footage details to Malcolm the following morning, Rhea confirmed that both signatures on the credit line application were digital copies pulled from legitimate older documents embedded with enough technical accuracy to pass a casual review but not a forensic one. She had the metadata, she had the timestamps, she had the login records showing which administrative account had made the changes and when. None of it pointed to me. Malcolm began preparing the legal response in layers. Divorce filing, civil suit, emergency account freeze requests, a share transfer injunction to prevent Caleb from moving his equity before we could attach it to the damages claim, and a referral package to the appropriate investigative agencies covering the embezzlement, the forgeries, and the planted evidence. He also quietly contacted the Wake County Contract Office and submitted a preliminary document under attorney-client privilege establishing that I had no connection to the suspect transactions and that a forensic review was underway. What I didn't know yet was that Caleb had already been working the other side of this. Malcolm discovered through a contact that Caleb had reached out individually to 3 of our largest clients, telling them that I was dealing with serious personal issues and might not remain in a leadership role much longer. He'd suggested they consider Eastline Systems Group as a continuity option, same technical expertise, smoother management. He'd also made contact with a member of the Wake County Evaluation Panel, implying that Arden Building Controls had undisclosed financial irregularities that might affect our ability to deliver on a long-term contract. He was seeding the ground. Once the anonymous complaint landed the one Simone planned to send to the bank and the county simultaneously, the clients and the panel would already be primed to believe the worst. I spent 2 days making individual visits to our 3 major clients under the cover of routine quality reviews. I didn't mention Caleb or what he'd told them. I brought project progress reports, technical documentation, and service guarantees. 2 of the 3 signed written confirmations that they had no plans to transfer their contracts to any other vendor. The 3rd was non-committal but not hostile. That was enough for now. Ria was simultaneously backing up every piece of financial data to an independent server she controlled, building a time-stamped record that would make it impossible to claim the files had been altered after the fact. Every night I came home and went through the motions. Simone talked about a cousin's wedding we'd been invited to in the spring. She asked whether I thought we should upgrade the guest bathroom before the holidays. I answered normally. I ate. I slept beside her. I am not going to pretend that part was easy or that I was handling it with any particular grace. Internally, I was not. But I understood that the moment I let something show, she would have time to move the money, wipe the accounts, and build a version of events where she was the one who had discovered the fraud and come forward first. I had seen her work. She was good at it. I could not give her a single moment of warning. The Friday evening everything accelerated. I was at a site inspection about 40 minutes outside Raleigh when the motion alert came through again. Simone had told me that morning she had no plans for the evening. On the camera feed, she and Caleb were in my office, and Caleb had brought a leather bag. He unzipped it on my desk and began removing documents, fake invoices, fabricated contracts, and printed transaction records from Linden Park Procurement and placed them one by one into the locked drawer beneath my desk. He had a key. I didn't know when he'd made a copy, and I filed that fact away in the part of my mind where I was keeping everything that I could not afford to react to in real time. Simone logged into the system and scheduled an outbound transfer of $380,000 set to execute Monday morning. When they finished, Caleb reached into the wall safe and removed the old wooden box I kept at the back of the second shelf. Inside it was my father's watch and the letter Gordon had written to both of us in the weeks before he died. Caleb opened the letter, read a few lines, and made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. He said our father had always believed I was the one who could hold the company together. He said that soon everyone would know the old man had been wrong. I had been holding myself at a controlled distance from all of this for weeks, managing it like a project, like a problem with steps and tools and a logical sequence. But watching Caleb hold that letter and say what he said about our father, something in that distance collapsed. Not into anger exactly, into clarity. There was nothing left in this situation to salvage between us. He hadn't acted out of desperation or a moment of poor judgment. He'd been building this for years, quietly, underneath the surface of every conversation we'd had since Gordon died, maybe long before that. The envy had been there the whole time. I just hadn't seen it because I hadn't been looking for it in my own brother. I pulled over on the highway shoulder and called Malcolm. I told him to activate everything on Sunday morning. He asked if I was sure. I told him I was. We had everything we needed, and Monday would be too late. I sent messages that evening to Simone, Caleb, our mother Estelle, Talia, Malcolm, and Rhea, asking them to come to the Arden Building Controls conference room Sunday morning. I said Wake County had reached a final decision on the contract and that the whole family should be present to hear the announcement together. Simone texted back within minutes that she wouldn't miss it. Caleb replied a few hours later with a single word, perfect. They thought I was handing them exactly the moment they had been engineering toward all along. They had no idea I had spent the last several weeks building the floor out from under it. Sunday morning arrived the way mornings do when you've barely slept, gray and too quiet, the details of the room sharper than they have any right to be. I got to the Arden Building Controls office on Capitol Boulevard an hour before anyone else and sat in the conference room with the lights off. On the wall across from me was the photograph my father had kept in every office he'd ever occupied. Gordon Arden, standing in front of the company's first truck, the vehicle dented and visibly old even then, the man beside it looking like someone who had no idea what he was starting and wasn't worried about that at all. I'd grown up with that photograph. I'd stopped seeing it years ago the way you stop seeing things that have always been there. That morning I looked at it for a long time. Malcolm arrived first, then Rhea, with 2 printed copies of her full forensic report in a folder she set at the end of the table without ceremony. Talia came in quietly and took a seat near the door. My mother Estelle arrived a few minutes later, and the way she looked at me when she walked in steady, composed, already braced, told me that some part of her had been waiting for something like this for longer than I knew. Simone and Caleb came together. They walked in talking, relaxed in the way people are when they believe they're walking towards something they've already won. Simone took a seat near the center of the table. Caleb moved to the chair at the far end, the chair that had been my father's during every board meeting this room had ever seen, and settled into it like a man taking inventory of what was about to become his. I thanked everyone for coming and told them that Arden Building Controls had cleared the technical evaluation for the Wake County contract. We were through the final review. The announcement was real. I had received the preliminary confirmation 2 days earlier and hadn't told anyone. Caleb smiled and spread his hands slightly, the gesture of a man accepting something already owed to him. Simone straightened in her chair. I let the moment sit for exactly as long as it took for both of them to settle fully into the assumption that this was going to go the way they'd planned. Then I told them that before we could move forward, there was something the company needed to address. I turned on the monitor mounted at the head of the conference table. The first footage was from the living room camera Simone and Caleb entering the house in North Hills, the ease between them, the way she turned toward him before they went upstairs. Nobody in the room said anything. Estelle looked at Caleb once and then looked at the table. Simone's expression shifted quickly into something prepared, and she said that the marriage had been over for a long time before that moment, that she had been lonely, that I had chosen the company over her repeatedly, that what she'd done was the consequence of a relationship that had already failed. She said it with the fluency of someone who had rehearsed it, and I understood that this was the version she'd intended to lead with when the time came. The sympathetic frame, the emotionally complicated exit. I didn't argue with her. I moved to the second clip. The conference room watched Simone enter the code on the wall safe in my home office. They watched Caleb remove my passport and the USB drive. They watched Simone photograph my signature from multiple angles while Caleb stood beside her and laid out the plan in his own words: the audit, the suspension, the voting shares, the takeover. The room that had been quiet before became something beyond quiet. Talia, who had known pieces of this but not the full recorded reality of it, looked at her sister with an expression I don't have a precise word for. Estelle's hands were flat on the table in front of her. Simone said the footage had been edited. She said it clearly and with conviction, the way you say something when you've anticipated needing to say it and have decided that confidence is the only available defense. Caleb said nothing. Rhea opened her folder. She walked through the forensic accounting findings without editorializing the payment trail from Arden Building Controls to Linden Park Procurement over nearly 3 years, totaling more than $1,180,000. The corporate credit line of $420,000 opened in the company's name. The 2 signatures attributed to me on those documents, both confirmed through metadata analysis to be digital copies extracted from legitimate prior filings. She described the secondary administrative account Simone had created under a variant of her own login credentials, active primarily during overnight hours, used to modify transaction approval records. She presented the timestamps. She presented the login data. She presented the version history showing when each change had been made and from which device. Then Malcolm laid out the correspondence emails Caleb had sent to 3 of our major clients, suggesting Arden Building Controls was in leadership transition and that East Line Systems Group would be positioned to absorb their contracts. Communications with a member of the Wake County Evaluation Panel implying that our company had undisclosed financial irregularities. The formation documents for East Line Systems Group, registered in Caleb's name, filed 14 months earlier. Caleb looked at me across the table and said that a man who knew how to build relationships and develop business was more valuable to this company than someone who spent his career checking schematics and tracking equipment costs. He said it without raising his voice, with the same measured tone he used in client meetings, as if we were discussing a difference of professional philosophy rather than the fact that his name was connected to $420,000 in fraudulent debt and 3 years of payments to a company that didn't exist. He said our father had built something that deserved better stewardship than it had been getting. I told him he wasn't trying to prove he could run the company better than me. He was trying to put me in prison so he could take what our father left behind. Caleb didn't answer that. The framing had no counter-argument that would have held up in that room with Rhea's documents on the table and the recorded footage still visible on the monitor behind me. Simone tried a different approach. She returned to the marriage the distance, the years of feeling secondary to the business, the way she had slowly disappeared inside a life that wasn't built around her. She said that I had to accept some responsibility for what the marriage had become. I told her that a failing marriage could explain why someone wanted to leave. It did not explain forged signatures, 3 years of embezzled company funds, or a locked drawer full of fabricated contracts placed in my office 2 nights before an anonymous complaint was scheduled to reach the bank and Wake County simultaneously. Those were not the actions of a woman who felt neglected. Those were the actions of someone who had decided that making me look like a criminal was the cleanest way out. She didn't respond. Estelle had not spoken since she arrived. She reached up and unclipped a key from her key ring, an old house key, the one from the original family home where she and my father had raised us, and placed it on the table in front of Caleb without touching him. She said that he had not only betrayed his brother, he had used their father's name and their father's company as instruments to destroy everything Gordon had spent his life building. Then she stood, pushed her chair back, and walked out of the conference room without looking at either Simone or Caleb again. Her footsteps in the hallway were the only sound in the building for a moment. Caleb moved to stand. Malcolm told him he needed to remain to receive the legal documents and advised him clearly that leaving before that process was complete would not be in his interest. Caleb sat back down. Malcolm then laid out what had already been executed that morning. The divorce filing was on record. Simone's access to all financial systems and accounting platforms had been revoked effective immediately. A freeze request on the Linden Park procurement accounts had been submitted to the relevant financial institutions. The outbound transfer of $380,000 scheduled for Monday morning had been blocked at the account level. Civil suits naming both Simone and Caleb had been filed. A share transfer restriction order had been placed on Caleb's equity stake. The full evidentiary package covering the embezzlement, the forgeries, and the planted documents had been submitted to the appropriate investigative authorities. The Wake County Contract Office had already received an independent forensic summary confirming that I had no involvement in the flagged transactions. And 2 of the 3 clients Caleb had approached had each signed written statements that they would not be transferring their contracts to East Line Systems Group. The plan they had spent years building had been, in the space of a single morning, disassembled at every point of contact. Simone asked to speak with me privately. She said she would sign over her claim to the house and make no demands on shared assets if I agreed not to forward the criminal referral. I told her that the divorce was a matter between the 2 of us and that I had no interest in punishing her beyond what the legal proceedings required. But the money she had taken did not belong to me. It belonged to the company, which meant it belonged to the employees who had worked there, the clients who had trusted our contracts, and the business my father had built from nothing over 24 years. I didn't have the right to trade their losses for my own convenience. The referral had already been submitted, and I was not going to attempt to retract it. Talia told the room that she was prepared to testify about the documents her sister had asked her to hold, including the business formation paperwork and the divorce materials, and that she had retained the originals in the condition in which she'd received them. Simone looked at her the way you look at someone you've decided has committed the greater betrayal, not the person who built the case against you, but the person who declined to help you escape it. Talia met her sister's eyes and said that telling the truth wasn't betrayal. What destroyed families was asking the people who loved you to carry your secrets for you. Caleb and Simone left at separate times. Caleb went first, without waiting for her, without a word to anyone in the room. When Simone walked out a few minutes later, she called his name in the parking lot. He was already in his car. He didn't look back. Whatever they had told each other about their future, the company they were going to run, the life they were going to build on the wreckage of mine, it had required secrecy and money and a story in which I was the villain. With all 3 of those things gone, there wasn't much left between them. 16 months passed. The divorce was finalized. Most of the money funneled through Linden Park procurement was recovered through account seizures and the forced liquidation of assets purchased with those funds. Caleb transferred the majority of his equity stake as part of the civil settlement, and with it went his role in the company permanently. Simone faced legal consequences for the embezzlement, the forgeries, and the deliberate placement of fabricated evidence. East Line Systems Group was dissolved before it had taken on a single client. Arden Building Controls passed its independent audit, retained the Wake County contract, and grew from 36 employees to 44 over the following year. I hired a CFO from outside the family, someone with strong credentials and no personal stake in anything except doing the job correctly. I restructured the authorization protocols so that no single person could approve significant transactions without a second signature, so that administrative system access was divided and logged, so that vendor relationships went through a verification process before any payments were issued. I kept the name on the building the same. Whatever Caleb had done, the name Arden still meant something to me, and I wasn't going to let his choices be the last word on what it stood for. On the day we signed the formal contract with Wake County, I put my father's watch on the corner of my desk and had his letter framed. I hung it on the wall beside the photograph of the old truck where it has been every morning since. That afternoon, I drove to my mother's house. Estelle made coffee and we sat at the kitchen table the way we used to when I was young and the world felt more manageable. She asked me if I thought I would ever forgive Caleb. I told her I didn't know. I told her I no longer wanted him to suffer, but that wanting someone to be okay and being willing to let them back into your life were 2 different decisions, and I hadn't confused them. She nodded like that was the right answer, or at least an honest one. Before I left, she pressed the old house key into my hand, the one she had placed in front of Caleb in the conference room and taken back afterward. She said my father had always believed that the person capable of holding something together wasn't the one who talked the loudest or knew the most people. It was the one who kept doing the right thing when no one was watching. The next morning, I was back on Capitol Boulevard before the crew arrived. New technicians running through their first site orientations, a project board showing the first phase of the Wake County installation, the ordinary specific work of keeping something alive. The cameras had shown me what I needed to see, but it was everything that came after, the patience, the documentation, the willingness to hold still when every instinct said to react that had actually gotten me through it. I hadn't saved the marriage. I hadn't saved the relationship with my brother, but I had saved my freedom, my name, and the company my father built from a used truck and a rented warehouse, on the belief that doing good work honestly, without cutting corners, was enough to build something that lasts. If this story stayed with you, if something about it felt familiar or reminded you of someone who held the line when everything around them was falling apart, then you already know what this channel is about. We tell the stories of people who didn't flinch, who gathered their evidence, who trusted the process even when it cost them something. If that's the kind of story you want more of, subscribe and keep this channel close. There's always another one worth hearing.